Thank you all.
Our next presenter is Michael Nasi, who is a partner with Jackson Walker. Welcome, with Mr. Nasi.
Thank you, Chairman Cook, Chairman Soliday.
We've got permission to hand out.
We've got some materials.
And these will also be available online for the public.
Great, thank you. Hard copies of the slides I'll present. I'm also providing in the packet testimony that I submitted, was invited by Congress, House Energy and Commerce Committee asked me to testify on the exact same topic. It goes into a lot more depth and documents a lot of studies that kind of back up a lot of the things I'll say today. Certainly an honor to be here. Concerned about the rule is an understatement. Definitely agree with all three buckets the Commissioner just hit, and so to value the committee's time, I will amplify key points, not try to repeat too much. I start in my slide deck here with some contextual slides, and I know the fundamental topic here is the EPA rule, but we must consider that the state of reliability and resilience of the grid is already in peril. I think you heard a little bit of that from ISO. Certainly, there is a lot of concern being expressed by national regulators. This is a FERC Commissioner, Mark Christie. All of the commissioners have been testifying repeatedly in Congress that we have significant problems heading into the coming years before we even consider the impact of this EPA rule. So I will circle back to the issue of the impact of this EPA, this carbon rule on the grid at the end, but let's hit a couple of topics first. Another contextual slide. There's a lot going on. Just in the power sector impacting coal and gas alone, we refer to this in the air quality geek world as the train wreck slide. We all have a version of it. It has to be updated because it's a constant flow of regulatory oversight from EPA. Arguably, most of these rules are overreach, but we're only talking about one. The next slide I have is what I call the four biggest threats to the grid focused on electricity. We're talking only about the last one today, but let's get to it. So in the attempt to summarize a few hundred pages of Federal Register with one graphic, I'm going to try to build a picture for you here about what this rule means for coal and then gas. And I cannot emphasize enough, this rule is just as impactful, if not more impactful for gas, and that is a critical consideration in Indiana, given what some of the resource planning goals are for some of the utilities moving forward in this state. In the coal arena first, basically EPA's rule, as the Commissioner identified, requires carbon capture if you want to have a full useful life of your facility beyond 2040. Otherwise, by January 1st of 2030, coal-fired generation in this country is going to have to commit to retire, in many cases prematurely, by certain dates if it wants to avoid different steps of regulation. I won't go into the detail of each, but the graphic attempts to try to tell you this. So by 2032, if you're willing to retire by 2032, you actually can just not increase emissions. So existing capacity, this is the only good news of this rule, is existing coal is okay till 2032 if you're willing to commit to retire at that point. If you want to live past that point, then you have a series of requirements. First, there's a capacity factor cap, so you basically have to limit how much you're going to utilize if you want to live till 2035. If you want to live till 2040, you actually have to start to co-fire natural gas, which affects a cut in carbon emissions. And as I mentioned, if you want to get beyond 2040, then you're subject to CCUS, which effectively, based on the current state of technology, is really a retirement mandate. And I'll talk a little bit more about that for both coal and gas. Gas, this is a very ugly graphic. This is what happens when lawyers try to do things graphically. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this graphic, although I do want it in the record because it does identify really every aspect of the gas standard, but I'm going to focus solely on this narrative slide. Because the biggest dilemma, I have clients all over the country trying to build new natural gas generation of different sizes, and every facility that I'm involved in that has large-scale natural gas, whether it's large frame combustion turbines or combined cycle turbines, is frozen. This rule effectively requires new gas of that size to choose between burning low GHG or green hydrogen at a 30, then 96% rate, so basically displacing the use of natural gas at a natural gas plant, or CCS. I'm a big advocate for CCS, carbon capture and storage. I've spent 2 decades of my career working on projects. I was involved with the biggest project in the world so far, Petronova in Texas. It has promise, but it is not, by any standard that can be applied in the Clean Air Act, adequately demonstrated, and you heard the commissioner identify that, and the comments have been robust from a number of different stakeholders that that's the case. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing CCUS where it makes sense. It means it can't be mandated as already demonstrated, because what it affects is a non-commercial, not viable technology on both coal and gas. Turning to so I will have a sidebar here on hydrogen. This is not your mother's hydrogen. I come from Texas. There's a lot of hydrogen made in Texas. None of that hydrogen is eligible under this standard. Low GHG hydrogen is 0.45 kilogram per kilogram of hydrogen. Green hydrogen does not exist as a real fuel in the real world and will not at scale by the time this rule would mandate its co-firing. And so why the commissioner was correct in focusing on that point of concerns about it is we're talking about a rule that would effectively require by 2038, which is really tomorrow for energy planning purposes, the entire large frame natural gas fleet, both existing and new, to displace the use of natural gas with that heretofore non-existent fuel. Huge scaling issues, huge infrastructure issues, which turns now to maybe a legal issue. So I am an environmental air quality lawyer. I was involved in several comments that were submitted. And I've done in this graphic an attempt to try to get that time frame, that bucket of timing that the commissioner talked about in an understandable format here. In red text on this slide is what the rule basically contemplates in terms of the way that the things are going to play out. So the commissioner identified that, yes, there's going to be this process of the state developing a plan. That process is important. It's been cut way too short. I agree with the commissioner. But even if you take the expedited time frame of what EPA has contemplated the states could do, we get shoved into this 3-year period the commissioner made reference to between 27 and 2030. All of these in blue, what I've done is what power plant owners are having to deal with. So immediately we have a rule that potentially pauses all new large frame gas planning, okay? It also puts a real question on what kind of retrofits you're going to put on an existing plant, coal or gas, because you've just been told that you have a limited horizon for that plant to exist. So there is an immediate retirement threat if this rule goes final and we don't stop it in the courthouse, and that will be a critical thing. But that period of 27 to 30 is critically important because that is when we're basically going to have to massively deploy the infrastructure necessary to be able to affect CCS or co-firing of hydrogen at a scale never done before, low GHG hydrogen. So it is effectively a massive retirement exposure for the grid, and that's what's at the far right-hand side. And I can't emphasize this enough, it's just as big a threat to gas because many of the capacity needs of our markets, many of the RTOs, MISO talked about it earlier today, are going to expect to be able to build thermal generation in the form of natural gas in order to actually replace the retirements that we're going to have in both coal and gas. So this is a huge issue. One moment on the legalities. Oftentimes the discussion of the West Virginia case is simplified in terms of, in applying the major questions doctrine, the Supreme Court said that EPA had to stay inside the fence. The more accurate Clean Air Act terminology would be that EPA is only explicitly statutorily authorized to mandate technologies that can be applied at or on the source. They violated that in the Clean Power Plan. They had this crafty idea in this rule to say, hey, we're not going outside the fence in this rule. We're not saying we're making you buy renewable energy outside the fence to net out your emissions. Instead, we're mandating CCS and hydrogen co-firing, okay? The problem with it is they might have started inside the fence with those technologies, but both of those technologies inherently rely upon outside the facility factors. Infrastructure that is outside the control of these individual operators. In order for CCS, for example, to work, a massive deployment of pipeline construction and geologic sequestration, permitting and landowner issues are basically forced upon all the operators, most of which, other than those that have basically a lottery of good geology right below their facility, it's an untenable obligation, certainly not one that the Clean Air Act was designed to require, and one that I'm confident the Supreme Court, if not the DC Circuit, will determine to be illegal. When it comes to hydrogen, we're talking about a fuel that is outside the control of every facility's ability to actually make sure can exist at scale. So it's like supersized outside the fence problem. It's totally unprecedented for any environmental rule to require the utilization of a fuel that does not exist at scale at the time of its adoption, let alone in the future. So let's talk about reliability, come full circle to some of the comments you heard from MISO. Some of the issues about the difference between accredited capacity and actual performance, right, or accredited capacity to reflect performance and installed capacity, those considerations, the shortages that MISO is projecting in the future, and certainly all RTOs are concerned, as I started the discussion today about, don't factor in the threat of this rule. This chart reflects data, summarizes data that was submitted into the record by several different associations. Some of my clients, I work heavily with rural cooperatives across the country. The National Rural Cooperative Association submitted a robust set of comments. Other associations have done as well. Projections differ in terms of how much capacity could be lost, but they all tell a striking tale. Coal, we're talking about the loss of those units that would not already be retiring at a scale that is really just kind of mind-blowing. But gas, too. If you look, we could exceed 204,000 megawatts of lost existing gas capacity. And remember what I said, EPA's rule effectively is capping the capacity factor and maybe even the economic ability to build new gas if it's finalized as proposed. So that's why you saw such uniform opposition to it. So sure, I think we will ultimately win the case to overturn this rule, but as some of you who have watched these kinds of issues before know, as Gina McCarthy, former air and administrator of EPA, has said, still part of the administration, even if they lose, they win, meaning that the uncertainty they will create will force retirements of both coal and gas, prevent gas from being built. So the key to this rule legally will be to stop it with an injunction from ever going into a place, which is what we got on the Clean Power Plan. First time the Supreme Court has ever done that in the history of our republic, by the way, which is telling something about how bad that rule was. I will tell you this rule is just as bad legally. It's hard to get a court to get their arms around these reliability factors. Many RTOs submitted comments. You heard reference to it, I think, already a little bit by the commissioner. Many state commissioners did as well. Most of the RTOs, meaning the regional transmission organizations, MISO, PJM, SPP, ERCOT, most of them didn't have time to get into the depths of EPA's grid analysis. But all of them said it is totally fundamentally wrong for EPA to have performed a grid analysis in its rule without ever talking to FERC, the federal statutorily charged reliability official, NERC, which also has reliability requirements, both federal entities, any state RTO, state or regional RTO. Their analysis was done by an environmental regulatory agency without consultation with grid experts. All of the RTOs that filed comments complained about that. Only one RTO had the time to do a full robust study because it actually has its own isolated grid, and that is ERCOT, in the state that I come from, Texas. ERCOT's analysis should be a warning shot to everybody. RTOs do not project gloom and doom. They generally are engineers that try to solve problems. When they say we have a problem, it is a big deal and needs to be heeded. ERCOT has projected that over 227 hours beginning in 2030, over 1 million megawatt hours of outages will occur because of this rule. They have a detailed analysis that shows that. Closer to home, MISO. One of my clients in the MISO market submitted a robust technical analysis on the grid impacts. And I have reference to that in the materials, and also will follow up with the committee if there's interest in that study in more details. The most important thing about this study is to know that yes, you can do an independent analysis and say EPA did it wrong. What these experts did is say, hey, we'll take EPA's model, we'll take all of their assumptions. We won't even dispute them, although we do, and we will run their numbers. The only thing we will change is instead of using their assumed performance for wind and solar, we will use actual data from four years in a row in MISO. And when you plug in actual data of wind and solar performance in terms of, during peak demand, this analysis shows hundreds of hours of outage. The analysis goes on to say if you actually built the generation, energy storage, and other things necessary to make up and prevent those outages, you would talk about a price tag of just within MISO of $246 billion. That's just to shore up the reliability impacts of the rule. So I'm very confident that this kind of analysis is going to be the kind of thing that the courts will have to say, well, wait a second, they're not even disagreeing with EPA in their grid analysis. They're using their model. They're just correcting an error in EPA's model, which is the accreditation that EPA used, which was at odds with what MISO uses. So once you use MISO and real-world data, you see big problems. I'll finish with this. I have been a big supporter of carbon capture technology, but let me be clear. It is not because the United States is moving the needle with domestic emissions. I've been showing this slide ever since the Clean Power Plan was proposed. Decarbonization of the domestic fleet is not a climate policy that will move the needle. Developing technologies that can be applied in the developing world to prevent their massive expansion of carbon dioxide emissions is, and that's why carbon capture makes sense as a technology, but not because existing coal and gas are a problem. This chart very clearly shows it's all based on real data. All of it source cited in both my testimony and on the slide itself. If you zero out the entire US fossil fleet, all coal, all gas gone, it's 0.7% impact on global CO2 concentrations. This is not a debate about climate science. This is math. And that part of the Clean Air Act that requires EPA to prove that their rule is materially impacting the problem, they have major legal exposure on this ground alone. I don't think the courts will reach this ground because I think they'll blow this rule up based on the outside the fence factors I described, but it's very important for policy folks like you to consider that these domestic decarbonization initiatives are not moving the needle globally, and they're doing real harm in terms of economics and reliability here at home. So thank you for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Nasi. Are there questions for Michael Nasi? Senator Randolph is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't understand in terms of that. You're saying that the percentage of decarbonization in this country will not move the needle at all, or you're saying that it has little effect on the globalization of the efforts to remove or minimize decarbonization? I mean,
it's a great question, so maybe really specific. I mean, to be fair, if 0.7% impact on the 2050 concentration is moving the needle, then I will stand corrected. I'm just saying materiality-wise, 0.7% impact of 2050 emissions is not moving the needle. And the reason is very simple, by the way. It's not a judgment against India, China, Vietnam, the ASEAN. These people, there's 2 billion people in the world that don't have electricity. There's arguably 3.5, maybe 4 billion people who are truly in energy poverty. Those nations are going to prioritize bringing electricity to their populations for the first time in their lives to extend their lives, to provide better opportunity. And so that big blue part of that pie is a great story of human flourishing, but it does carry with it a massive expansion of carbon dioxide emissions. And so our modern economies that have already become efficient, where we've reduced our CO2 gross emissions and will continue to do so, means that moving forward, we will be less and less of that piece, and they will be more and more. So the things we do need to be commercializing technologies that are relevant to them, affordable technologies that they can use, as opposed to thinking we're doing something by prematurely shutting down a bunch of power plants and keeping new ones from being built when it actually creates economic and reliability hits.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator. Then thank you, Mr. Nasi, for your presentation. Our final presenter of the morning is Skip Kropp with Steptoe and Johnson. Welcome.